stand here, if you don't mind. Is that okay? Let me just thank Doyen for that introduction. She's embarrassing me. Now, you created very high expectations, and I just want to acknowledge my fellow speakers this morning, Tinu, Nick, Benda, Etin. Thank you very much. And I think you've already started a very good conversation around these issues and the complexity of them. I have been looking at these issues for most of my academic career. It feels like forever. It feels like my whole life. And so hopefully I can share some things with you that I've been thinking about and that may be helpful to you. I just want to say something. I am an American. This is really an American accent. I live in South Africa because my husband is South African. And when apartheid ended, he was able to go back home. So I took the career move and moved with him 10 years ago. And it actually has been a blessing to me to have made that move. Because in a way, I said to people, it made me adapt. It made me have to look at these issues of ethnicity and difference in a total different context, which Dr. Kinney spoke about. You know, how the context helps to frame the issues and what is salient. And my own identity became much clearer to me because I had to go to another context. So what I want to do, and I see I'm standing between the group and lunch, which is a dangerous position. But what I thought I would do the time I have is just to try to share with you my thoughts about how research, particularly research from social psychology and from organizational behavior, where a lot of the diversity, as Dr. Kinney spoke about, people are talking about diversity, where those two come together, and do they provide us with any practical tools? So can we take some of that theoretical evidence and see if we can apply it? Now, I don't say that I have all the answers because often I'm very confused, and what happens in the laboratory may not spill over into the field, okay? So bear with me. Also, I think I've sent a copy of this presentation, so people are welcome to have it. And also, because we always interpret things through our own mindset, I've actually listed the references, the things that I drew from. So you can also, if you're not tired one night and then you want to put yourself to sleep, you can read, I'm joking, you can read those references and then get your own interpretation, because we filter things, right? Yeah. And my background, I'm not a psychologist. I am more coming from a human resource management background. That's what I got my PhD in, and more MBA. So I have a business kind of orientation too as I look at this stuff. But I do admire what psychologists are able to do and read a lot of that work. So that's a long introduction. But let me start here. You know, we think of this idea of diverse people. Now that's what we call everybody now, diverse people. But I think this already came out from our speaker, Benda, when he said, one of the things we have to understand, and this is an assumption I'm working from, is that we do race and ethnicity. It is us who do it. It's not out there. And I think that's one of the first things that we must make clear to everyone in our organizations, that we do race and ethnicity. It's not something abstract. And how do we do it? We do it in our social interactions. So the ways in which we interact with people, we actually create the meanings of these things and how they affect decisions and who gets what, who is excluded, who's included, who gets to be a top manager, who gets to be a secretary. And I think what I would say to you as people who are dealing with these issues every day, that the workplace is one of the major places where we do this, right? And the workplace is often one of the places where people of different races and ethnicities come together. Because in other settings, it's possible to stay with your own in-group. You know, like in the US, we always say the most segregated hour of any day is Sunday morning, when people are worshiping, because people tend to worship in their own groups. So one of my things is that we do race and ethnicity. The other thing, but what we do, we don't do this just in a vacuum. They're rooted in psychological processes, social and historical, and ideological processes. Ideas and beliefs about race and ethnicity. See? And notice there, folks, I put race in those single quotes. I'll tell you why I do that for two reasons. One is race is socially constructed. It's a problematic term, right? And I just want you to know that I know it's problematic and that there's no such thing as races. We know that, right? Right? No, nobody's answering. There's no such thing as races, right? No, you see the hesitation there, right? Yeah. Because we know that people act as if races are real. You know, so one of the things is that race is socially constructed, but we still are with this sense that some people think there are such things as races, you know, the black race, the white race, the yellow race, this race, and they can go in a hierarchy. But we know it's not the case. It's all socially constructed. And I'm also sensitive to the fact that in some parts of the world, you don't use the term race. Like you cannot, it's not a popular concept or used in the UK, right here. You use ethnicity, okay? In South Africa and in the US, we use race, and people use the word race because of the history of its meaning in that context. Now in Germany, you cannot use race either. So it's a contested kind of idea and contextualized. But I was saying to Dr. Kinney earlier, having been in the US and also in South Africa, and reading even the research published in many countries, unfortunately, race and ethnicity tend to act the same way when it leads to exclusion, right? Yeah, so they kind of have a very familiar way of sorting people into issues of difference, discrimination, and inequality. That's what I said to people when I went to South Africa and the US, because I was in business, in the business schools, teaching there. I was often the first black woman in any business school that I went to in the US. Then I get to South Africa, which is a majority black country, and I repeat that experience. I'm the first black woman in this business school in South Africa. So it felt like deja vu all over again. But in the last point, I made this point that the workplace is a major site for intergroup interactions, and I always feel like then I have a bigger responsibility, because maybe some of the inroads and insights that we get in the workplace might inform generally larger society. This is particularly true in South Africa because despite the end of apartheid, most black people still live in the townships with other black people. The workplace is one place in South Africa where people get together across race and ethnicity. So it actually almost becomes a natural laboratory for trying to figure out some of these issues. So as I said, these things are a basis of inequality and power and privilege, along with gender and class and other categories of difference. So even though I'm going to focus on race and ethnicity, we do have to be aware that they can interact with other dimensions of difference to have the impact on who you are. Okay, do you recognize this person? W.E. Du Bois. I use him because I think that he was one of the first people in the United States who tried to talk about this whole issue of ethnicity and race and what it was like to be in the group that was not the majority, to be in that out group. So he said two things that still inform us. He said the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. Interestingly, I feel like I think if he were to come today, I think the 21st century, this question is still with us. How do we solve, or how do we reasonably engage with this issue that we're still divided as a world, wherever you may go, around these issues? And I think with globalization, with immigration, with migration, the questions are becoming even more complex. So even for multinational companies, it's not just your national issues, it's also you're doing business in many different countries. You know, so if your company came to do business in South Africa, you would be confronted with a whole nother dimension of how do you deal with these issues in that context. And then the other thing is, what does it feel like to be a problem? And you see, this is the thing that personally that's bothered me for the last 30 years, and even in my own life. That if you haven't read this book, it's interesting to read it, The Souls of Black Folk. Du Bois was trying to explain to the American citizenship at that time, he was trying to talk about the lived experience of being an African American in America. And I know, Dr. Kenny, you were calling for more of that kind of research. And he talked about what is it like to be a problem, that your difference is a problem, not something good. And see, I think organizations have this problem. You know, theoretically, we say what? Diversity and diverse ideas, and organizations say they want to be more creative and innovative. And we know a diversity of ideas is more likely to get you to creativity and innovation. But even though we talk about valuing diversity, we still are not able to get beyond the fact that these people are not like us, they're going to be a problem. You know, so he writes eloquently about it. It's worth reading it because you would think, okay, is this the 20th century or the 21st century? So I just put that in. And so when I did the reading now, because I went and started reading very closely to say, what are the social psychologists saying about this issue? And what are the organizational behavior people saying? And it's very interesting where we are now. They reach a similar conclusion. So if you take on the right-hand side, this is what we'd like to have, right? All kinds of people, all mixed up, different, no matching between their skin color and what they do, right? This happy group working together productively. Looks good, huh? Yeah. But what we have, you know, we like to think we're a post-race society. We have an inclusive workforce. Everyone is diverse, right? In some dimension. And then value this diversity. And it's interesting to me, having been around for a long time looking at this, that when I started my career, we were asking questions like, is there discrimination in this selection technique? So we did a lot of studies on adverse impact. Then we moved to equal opportunity. Then we moved now to valuing diversity. So there's been this evolution in the U.S. So these are two social psychologists. You might want to look at this paper, Paluk and Green. It's a very good paper published by the American Psychological Association, where they looked at all of the literature on how do you reduce prejudice and discrimination. They looked at all of it. And they concluded that despite all of this research we've done, that we still need more to figure out how to reduce these things, the questions you are asking now. But we do have some information that we can use, but they're saying there's a need for more. And then you go to the organizational behavior literature, Myrtle Bell. Now she's even talking more currently after more than 2 decades of diversity research, as well as anti-discrimination legislation. Workplace exclusion persists. And this is interesting to me, her point, because I have to confess, I have a confession. Probably if you read some of my stuff a few years ago, I wasn't particularly enamored of social psychology research on bias and discrimination because I thought they were staying too much on the cognitive side, on the individual behavior. So I was very much around the structural solutions, the sociology structure, make people do things, put laws in. Then I go to South Africa. And South Africa has the laws. The laws are extremely strong. The Constitution outlaws every form of discrimination you could think of. It has actually been put up as a model constitution because it prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex, religion, all of the categories. You know that. Many countries don't have sex as an anti-discrimination thing. The second thing about South Africa, very strong policies. Like companies in South Africa, I don't know if you know this, is something called Black Economic Empowerment. Companies in South Africa have to make sure that 25% of the company is owned by Black people to transfer wealth and power. So all the laws are there, and on top of it, the majority government is composed of Black people. But guess what? I go into organizations there to do this work, and I see the same obstacles. So the structure is not enough, the policies are not enough, and it's made me appreciate more that we need a combination. I'm giving you my punchline. We need to bring together the individual changes and behaviors that need to be done, and at the same time integrate that with structures and policies. We have to work on both levels. It's very important that we work on both levels. So what I want to try to answer in the time between now and lunch, how can we do race and ethnicity differently in the workplace? And specifically, what can we learn from social psychology research that will help us to figure out the best interventions? And I put the emphasis on interventions because I've been talking to people about this. I think we need to do much more, not to say things like, why can't people naturally get this? Right? There's been this kind of thing that we don't want to teach people about this stuff or to give them theories or to give them things. We think that people ought to naturally come to this as common sense. And I'm much more now the domain of the thought that we ought to be more deliberate and planned in our interventions. And I have found, in some of the work I've done in South Africa, I have found that even though you have resistance, when you have people in organizations are generally smart people. Why don't we let them in on what we know? Huh? Yeah. They like it, like this group I just worked with, it was a mining company, one of your old companies to change. And like, oh, we didn't know all this stuff was out here. You mean there's theory about this stuff? Like, yeah, there is. And they like being in on understanding, oh, is that why I act like that? Or is that why I think that way? So I think we should share some of our theory with the actual people on the ground. Okay, let's go on. So let's talk about stereotyping. All the speakers have spoken about stereotyping. Let me give you my take on stereotyping. Now, stereotyping, we know a lot about why that people stereotype. It's almost a natural kind of cognitive process. We all do it. It's been just said, we all do it. I do it, you do it, everybody does it, okay? So even like with me, when I got to South Africa and people saw my name is Nkomo and a Black woman walks in, and then I start speaking. And you see people, they go like this. Why? They were expecting a Black South African woman, not a Black American woman. In the US, they didn't know what to expect because Americans couldn't even comprehend a name like Nkomo because there was no vowel between the N and the K. So if I was speaking to a group like this where most of the people didn't know me, they first of all would say Nkomo. They put an A there or something. And so I would come into a room like this and they don't know me. I'm just telling you this story to show you how stereotyping functions, which I think you know how it functions. So I'd come in and then the organizers would be looking for this Nkomo. And then finally I would go over and introduce myself and I'd say, I'm still in Nkomo. And they go, no, you can't be. I am. Oh, sorry. We were expecting a 5-foot Japanese woman, which I understood. Now, I didn't get angry because that was reasonable, but anyway. So this came up, the stereotype threat. This idea that for ethnic and racial minorities, that the work that's very good is the work of Claude Steele. He's got a book out now, Whistling Vivaldi. It's a nice book because it's written in a very everyday language. But what Claude has looked at carefully is the subtle ways that we devalue and marginalize others. And the fact that people know that my particular identity is under threat or may be devalued, it affects their performance. They become anxious. They're worried about this stereotype. And so they don't trust the environment. And in fact, he has shown in very convincing laboratory experiments that in fact it affects people's achievement. And to me, that's a worry for organizations. You bring in talented black people, black women or women, and then they're under this identity threat cloud. And so what's good about Steele's work is that he's now trying to take it to a solution step. What do you do to reduce this identity threat? And what's very good about his research, you mentioned the majority group, he's actually, when people said, oh, you're crazy, there's no such thing as this cloud, he's actually been able to do experiments where he has created this phenomena in the US with white men. This thing about, he uses the thing that white men are not very athletic. They can't play basketball. So he uses that as demonstrating that in fact then it affects their performance. So he can demonstrate this effect. But here's what I want to talk about. What's the solution to identity threat? Well, he's come up with this idea that you can mitigate stereotype threat by looking at the signals that are taking place in the workplace. And he uses 2 dimensions to look at that. And he calls those social identity contingencies, in the sense that we can look at, he's put together 2 variables that signal to people, how safe is this environment for me to work in and to be who I am? So one is the level of representation. How many people are in the organization that are like me? And the second one is the diversity philosophy of the company. What is the company's philosophy and view in terms of how they think about people, racial and ethnic minorities? And then he puts this in a little formula, which you know that psychologists have to do. And he says that identity safety is a function of this level of representation times the philosophy. So when you do that, you're going to come up with this kind of diagram. It's going to have to be a 2x2 diagram, right? Then you really know you're an academic when you can do a 2x2 diagram. It's true, we never have 3x3. We can't do cubes, but we can do these. But actually, I find it helpful because I think this one, these are my biases of things that convince me. So he says, okay, you are a black woman and you come into a company. And the company has never said anything about we value diversity, we value women. They've never espoused anything. In fact, what they do, they're either silent about it, they make no reference to diversity or difference, or they say, everybody's the same. In this company, everybody's the same. There's only one thing that counts, and that's performance, right? And so what he found, and this is done in field work, that if a person sees that the company has a colorblind philosophy, and then there's very few people in that organization like them, they feel quite threatened. They don't feel that their identity is going to be safe here. They actually feel like it's going to be a problem. I may be excluded. They don't trust the environment, okay? Because there's no people in here who look like me. Plus, the company doesn't even seem to be aware of this. They don't say anything about it. See? Now look at these. Look at the differences here. The highest level of safety is this, where the company has expressed, we value diversity. We want diverse people here. In fact, by having diverse people here, we think we do better as a company. And then you look around and there's lots of people like you that you will feel more safe. That the company's philosophy is consistent with what? Its practice. You see? So he's just saying that people read the environment, you know? And so one of the things I tell companies, don't do this. It's terrible to hire a solo person, you know, with no intent of ever hiring more. You're laughing. You've seen that. No, okay. No, but it's not something done on purpose. It may feel like a big breakthrough. But if you hire only one person of that kind, and then you don't do enough to quickly start building a critical mass, it's going to be a problem. Of being a solo, a token, you know, or, you know, what some companies in the U.S. used to do, they had what I would call the black position. So there was one job that they would always put the black person in, and the only time they brought another black person is when that person left. And so these dynamics that we can create. So if you look at this, then you can see that if you value diversity and you don't have as many people of that kind, it's still seen as relatively safe. The green means safe. You get that? Red means not good. Okay, and then over here, this is interesting. If the company has expressed a colorblind philosophy, but then there's high representations of ethnic minorities, people say, okay, the company may really be saying, we think everybody is good. You see? Because now they've hired people who are diverse. You see that? It's an interesting practical. So what cues are you sending out to people by how you talk about it in representation? So I think this is an interesting thing that we can take from social psychology. The other area I want to do is identity research. Identity has become very big, not only in social psychology, but also in organizational behavior. And so just a few quick points. It's really about the question of who am I? You know, the whole work of social identity theory, Tajeville, is about people trying to figure out who am I. So one of the things we have to say is that answering that question, your race and ethnicity, even if you're not aware of it, gives you a partial answer to this question. So even for white people who might say, I don't have a race, I don't have ethnicity, yes, you do, even if you don't think about it. The second point is social identity theory, which was already talked about. I'm not going to beat that to death, in the sense that we know that how we define ourselves is partially answered by how I think about myself, but how other people think about myself, how they think about me. So it's a two-way definition. And the other thing from social identity group theory is that we can easily divide people into in-groups and out-groups. So we have to have that in mind. The in-group, out-group phenomena. And the majority group, or people who are like me, are the in-group. Those on the margins are seen as the out-group. And that people have multiple identities. We're not just, you cannot just reduce me, Stella, to a black person. There's other dimensions to me, but as Benda said, through all of these different experiments, we know then when I walk in this room, the first thing you notice probably was my phenotype, my skin color. And so that can become the overwhelming way that which you think about me. Or you see me as a member of a group and you never get to those wonderful personal identities of the person. And then fault lines. I don't know, have you seen this research on fault lines? I mean, this is kind of interesting because Lau and Mernighan have come up with this idea that how in organizations and some of the practices, sometimes very unconsciously, we set up fault lines, and these are fault lines like in the sense of an earthquake, that we set up these in-group, out-group dynamics, and then something can trigger them and they erupt. Can I give you a real live example from a company in South Africa? It's a big insurance company, and this is a large insurance company, and just given the history of the company and the way in which they were beginning to transform themselves, it was a situation where, like I love it, we don't have it in the US, but I know you have it here too, a tea room, where people go to have their tea break. So this is a real episode. There's a tea room, and the tradition is people come in the morning before they start work to get tea. So this middle manager, about 9 o'clock in the morning, about 9:30 in the morning, he's having meetings with clients, and he tells his secretary, would you please make tea for my clients? So she goes to the tea room, the secretary, and she wants to make tea for his clients, but there's no milk. The milk is all finished. So she goes back and tells the manager, I'm sorry, I can't make tea for your clients because we don't have any milk. So he goes into an outrage. This is embarrassing. I have to have tea for my clients. And I dare those black women use up all the tea. The milk. So he goes to the managing director of the company and he complains and he says, the black women used up all of the milk and therefore I was embarrassed my clients could not have any tea. And so now the MD now is stuck with a problem. What does he do? So he goes to the black women and he accuses them of, why did you use up all the milk? You've made this middle manager very upset. And before they can have any explanation, he says, from now on out, I'm closing down the tea room. Nobody will have tea. And then the whole organization goes into a very negative spiral. The black women are quite upset. They withdraw. They threaten to go to their union. They start saying it wasn't us. The manager now calls in the consultants. What do we do? People used to get along fine. Now they're fighting. And so when we started looking at the situation, part of the problem was the company had so many fault lines. It was just a matter of time before some incident created a dynamic where people were fighting, people couldn't work. The black workers wanted to quit the company, go on strike. Well, here's the fault line. All of the black people, the black women, were all in lower level jobs. The white women were all the secretaries. The white men were all the managers and the decision makers, right? And so you're just creating these frictions that go beyond it. And what was ironic about it, when we got to the root of the problem, it wasn't the black women who even used up the milk. It was in fact the white secretaries that morning who had used up all the milk because they brought in cereal. And they put milk in their cereal that morning. And because the whites were not really familiar with how black people eat in the morning, they don't eat milk and cereal. They eat something called a fat cake, which is a donut. You see? So the point is that what are the fault lines that are created just by the way that the compositions occur, or how you put together a work team? So if you put together a work team like young black women, they all happen to be in the lower level positions, then you put all the 50-year-old white men who are in the higher positions together. If they get a dispute, it can resort down to either gender, age or race. That's a long-winded thing, but you should read that literature. So how do you bridge all of these potential social identity conflicts? I'm not saying it has to result in identity conflicts, but how do we bridge it? That's what I'm here to talk about. What do we do about this? Well, the social psychologists have given us some hints, and we'll have to think about how can we do this practically. So for example, if you had 5 people, these are individuals, but they happen to all look alike. I'll just use a situation. We might look at them as a group and see them as Black Africans, right? We look at the group identity. But the social psychologists say, no, we have to teach people how to decategorize. Decategorization. So what can we do to help people to recognize people as individuals? So instead of just seeing Black Africans, we personalize it, that's now Temba, Mavuso, Nia, helping people to relate to the individual. So one of the things they say is helping people to decategorize, give people a chance to know that there are other dimensions to Stella besides her being part of this Black African group. The other one is recategorization, helping people to move from us and them to we. And I think, Dr. Kinney, you had this in your slide, that the common group identity model, that leaders need to make sure they come up with a common goal or vision that will unite people. Helping people to look at the broader objective and to minimize their differences. So helping people, so coming up with this overarching goal that brings people together versus increasing the us versus them. The last one is kind of interesting, cross-cutting categories. In South Africa, they've done a lot of this now. That if you look at your typical miner as an underground mining, they mostly look like that guy on the left in pre-apartheid, in apartheid days. But by bringing more women into a category that was exclusively only white men than Black men, it breaks up the stereotype. You see? And notice my picture is more than one woman miner. You cannot just do one woman. To break this idea that only men can be miners, cross-cutting categories. This comes from Marilyn Brewer's work, where she says, wherever you can, try to create cross-cutting categories. And as people begin to see, and now the dialogue in South Africa has actually changed now. It's not that it's easy for these women, but you don't hear this stuff anymore a lot like, oh, women can't be minors. You see, it's hard now to put forth that argument because there are many women now who are doing mining and doing it well. But you can't just have one woman. It's not going to break the categorization. So, and then this is a very interesting one, which kind of goes against intersectionality in a different way. Marilyn Brewer, this is a very interesting study she's done. Marilyn Brewer says, one of the things we have to do when we do workshops around diversity is to help people develop a more complex understanding of the categories to which they belong. I'll say that again, helping people to develop a more sophisticated understanding of the categories to which they belong. Okay, so let's use this example on the left. I might be a female lawyer, technically 2 categories of identity. But if we go only to the intersection of those identities, where I think only of myself as a female lawyer, that's my specific identity, and that's my perception of who I am. I'm a female lawyer. And that's how I'm engaging the world. That means that I don't, my in-group is female lawyers. So who do I exclude? Well, I don't consider male lawyers to be in my in-group. And I don't consider women who are not lawyers to be in my in-group. You see? It becomes a very simple idea of who I am, right? So Marilyn says we should try to help people to have a more complex formation of their identity. Yes, I'm a female lawyer, that's fine, but that identity also connects me to other people that I normally would not think are in my in-group. I'm also part of the women. I'm like other women have things with me, so I expand my sense of in-groups. So yes, I'm part of all women. I'm part of all lawyers. And this gets to the idea that maybe in some of our training we emphasize differences too much. And we ought to look also where people overlap. You see? So even though I'm a female lawyer, there are probably things that I can share and talk with other women about. You know? Some commonalities, not to say the differences. Does that make sense to you? Like getting people to think. And what she's done in the field work, she's done field work on this, where she's shown that when people have more experiences where they do get to make this connection and to talk about it, that they are much more open and much more tolerant in their own thinking. Openness becomes bigger, okay? How are we doing on lunch? Oh. Okay, the last one is contact hypothesis. Okay, yeah, we're a little bit off the lunch. Contact hypothesis. Now, Thomas Pettigrew probably wrote the book on contact hypothesis. But this is instructive. This is a meta-study where they looked at all of the research that's been done on this. And this is a very interesting paper because it's 515 studies they've looked at, covering 250,000 participants from USA, Europe, Israel, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Africa, Asia, and Latin America. So it's pretty comprehensive. Now, what did they find? The contact hypothesis can work. Contact can help to break down the barriers of race and ethnic differences. It does work. And that they looked at lots of different categories of differences, but they found when they looked just at racial and ethnic intergroup contact, there was a positive effect. And this held across regions. They didn't find differences because it was in Africa, Asia, UK. This idea of having people in contact with each other does help. And the workplace. And benefits spread beyond immediate contact situations, the spillover. That's why I said the good work you do in organizations can spill over into the general society. So we have an opportunity to have a bigger impact. I'm very optimistic about that. I think we can. But, let's put the but. Are these optimal conditions necessary? Because in the original contact hypothesis theory, Gordon Allport said, well, there had to be certain conditions for this contact to work. Well, when Pettigrew and Troop looked at that, really it wasn't true. The only thing that was really critical was one thing. That whatever you do should not be happenstance. It should be structured programs, sanctioned by authorities, which somebody already mentioned. That if you're going to do an intervention, okay, it should be well structured and it should have buy-in and sanctioning from management. And so, for example, some of the things they found was mentorship alone is not good. You have to combine it with sponsorship. If you're going to do diversity training, it's not enough just to do awareness training. You have to do skills. So it had to be structured and also formal. So from organization studies, we find out that the importance of top management commitment and action for diversity initiatives and diversity training. So it had to be much more holistic and systematic. And on the diversity training, that what I've learned on diversity training is a lot of it is too haphazard. It's not well planned out. There's not a lot of good goal setting and even evaluating the effect of the training And then somebody mentioned this already. How do you make sure that the training that is taking place in a workshop, that people are able to transfer that learning to the workplace, back to their work setting? Are there support mechanisms in place to encourage the transfer back into the workplace? And in a project we're doing in South Africa now, you know who the critical people we're finding out? Middle managers. You have to work with middle managers in terms of that transfer of learning. It's so critical, and we kind of forget that those are the real implementers of anything, and that people live in their departments. So let me wrap up. Those are my thoughts. I probably left out some things because I did want to say something there. It just occurred to me when I talked about identity safety. I didn't tell you the matching research from OB. The matching research from OB is the importance of diversity climate. That identity safety is the way they talk about it in social psychology, but in OB we talk about the diversity climate, the climate for diversity. And the key thing there, again, is looking at the values that have been expressed. Has a value, what is the philosophy? What are the organizational values? And even like the practices, even the physical arrangement. You know, it was very typical, it's very typical in South Africa. Now they've changed it. When I first got to South Africa 10 years ago, you go to Anglo-American, like the big mining company, and when you go into the reception hall, there's the pictures of all the previous CEOs. And every one of them was a white Afrikaner guy. Can you imagine the effect when you walk in there as a black woman and you look at that wall? It's already saying to you, your picture is not going to be up there. So part of this thing is that when we talk about organizational climate and culture, I think we should be very clear. What is culture? It's your artifacts and your symbols, but it goes all the way down to your practices. How you select people, how you promote people, you know? And those unconscious, taken for granted, things that we don't even talk about, like who can be a top manager here? And there's wonderful work from, I forget her name, Ashley Rosette. Prototypical. There are these prototypical, deeply embedded assumptions that people can't even speak about what it means to be a top manager and what we expect of them. So if you don't challenge these taken for granted ideas that a leader must be like this, a leader must be assertive, a leader must be tall. I mean, there's even stupid stuff like that, right? So the prototypical conceptions of what is a leader. And if you don't look at those deeply held assumptions about how do we define success around here, they could be racially and ethnically biased, even though they appear to be neutral. They may not, in fact, be neutral. They may keep certain people out. Here's the cautionary tale, the caveats. And Dr. Kinney already mentioned this. You know, you realize how far the tentacles of America reaches in terms of knowledge. Most of the social psychological research is based on research done in the USA. You know, you can't even say it's Western. It's really USA, to be clear. And even if you go to your journals here, I was just looking, a lot of the authors are Americans. So that's something to think about. Maybe taking some of this research and looking at it specifically within the UK context. Okay, the other thing is dwelling in the cognitive. I think I already spoke about that. You know, we cannot just dwell in the cognitive. That's part of it. But we must put it together with the policies and the structures. How do we make both things happen together? There's a lot to be said for helping people to understand their individual behavior, but they need to also understand how the context and the broader history and things, it reinforced them. One of my students said, well, are you saying that we're puppets? We're marionettes? No, we're not marionettes. But we need to understand how some of the things in the structure reinforce and even support our behaviors. And then out of the lab into the real world. more and more of this research has to be replicated in field studies. So if you find something in the lab, then taking it to the field study, because if you do diversity work, organizations are real living, breathing systems. So we can't tell them, okay, we want to hold this still while we measure this. So we have to learn how to do it in the field setting and how to change or manipulate what we learn. Can there be a diversity science? Well, there's some very good work coming from a woman named Virginia Plaut, P-L-A-U-T. And she's talking from a social psychological point of view, where we really need to work more on what is the science of diversity. Looking more at not just individual, but how do we combine the structural with the individual to come up with some evidence that we can speak strongly to, where we accumulate a body of knowledge that specifically deals with these issues of diversity in organizations, that we need to look at that. Because it has to be, in the end, she says, a science, if you want to solve problems in a real way. It's an interesting read. I put it on the list. And then the significance of diversity ideologies. We really need to pay attention to what is the belief system that's guiding how people in this particular nation is thinking about issues of race and ethnicity. I'll use the US example. In the US right now, after the election of Barack Obama in 2008, what you heard on the street was, oh, great, we have solved this problem of race. Look, this proves that in America, anybody can do anything they want to do, because in the highest office, we have a black man. So now it became impossible. If you were trying to do diversity work between about 2008 now, actually there was cutbacks. The training budgets went down, because guess what? It's no longer a problem. And I even heard from black managers and people, they say, I cannot raise my hand anymore and say there's discrimination, because the ideology has shifted to this color blindness. There's no such thing anymore. So you need to think about in the context of the UK, how is this broader ideology about, ethnicity and different groups, what are people saying? Because that does spill into the workplace. It makes your work more challenging, or the work has to be positioned differently. So I think diversity ideologies are also important as we construct solutions to this work. So I will end there. I hope I've added some value. I've enjoyed speaking about this, and I'll be happy to engage you further. Thank you.